Bismillahirrahmanirrahim, and welcome to another episode of AMUK podcast. We are back with our young friend Shah Zuberi, and today he'll be talking about Ibn Sina's understanding of existence and God and how they relate to each other. So I will hand it over to you, Shah Zuberi. Tell us what did Ibn Sina think?
Thank you for that. Okay, so Assalamu alaikum everyone. We will be talking about Avicenna and how he understood the ontological and cosmological frameworks of creation. Now, Ibn Sina was an Aristotelian philosopher. That separates him from other philosophers we have had, for example, Mullah Sadra, or in some instances Ibn Arabi, who were Neoplatonists. Now, while there's definitely a degree of overlap in what Ibn Sina says and what Mullah Sadra and Ibn Arabi say a few centuries later, there is still a distinction within how Ibn Sina looks at ontological architecture, because while it is emanationist, it is non-monistic. This is controversial. However, if we really look at what Ibn Sina is saying and the strict emphasis he has on rationalism, that is, denying supernatural occurrences, this actually begins to make a lot of sense. Now, before we actually look at what Ibn Sina says, I'd just like to point out why there is an overlap between what Ibn Sina says and what Ibn Arabi and what Mullah Sadra say. Or Shahabuddin Sohrawardi as well, who's an important figure in this entire tale. Ibn Sina had access to Aristotle's philosophy. He is known as an Aristotelian philosopher, and he cites himself as one as well. In fact, if we look at the three teachers of Aristotelian metaphysics, you will have Aristotle as the first teacher, you will have Al-Farabi as the second teacher, and then you will have either Al-Kindi or Ibn Sina as the third teachers. The problem with this categorization is that a few books that Ibn Sina would think of as Aristotelian or Aristotle's own writings were actually Neoplatonist writings that had been erroneously translated by Arab translators as Aristotelian works, whereas they were actually emanationist Neoplatonic works. This is important historical context for why you will see some similarities between Ibn Sina's division of the universe in 10 intellects and why there is some overlap with the Tanazzulat Sitta of Ibn Arabi and the Tashkik of Mullah Sadra. Now, with that out of the way, I'd just like to start. When Ibn Sina seeks to define an entity, he defines it in accordance to what its essence is, that is, how a thing is in its essence. For example, me. Am I a material object? Am I an immaterial object? What am I? So, an example of this is we can perfectly conceive of a mythical beast's essence without affirming that it exists, right? That I can have a conception of something that exists in my mind, even though it does not exist beyond it. So, that is the first question he asks. The second question he asks is whether or not that thing actually exists. Is it only a conception? Or is it something that is actually present beyond my consciousness, beyond the mental sphere? Now, the fact that a thing is wujud, right? So, based on these distinctions within an entity, he categorizes everything that exists into contingent beings, that is mumkin al wujud, and the necessary existence, which is wajib al wujud. Now, what's a contingent being? A contingent being is one whose conception you can have in your mind, but that does not necessitate that it actually exists in real life. For example, you can conceive of a perfect triangle whose interior angles equal 180 degrees. But that does not actually exist. So it is a contingent entity, whereas the necessary existent, there's only one, is a being who you must conceive of as a baseline, and then it is indisputable that the thing is. Now, what does that mean? For Ibn Sina, God alone is wajib al-wujud. That is, not only do I have a conception of God, it is rationally necessary that God actually exists for me to make sense of the universe. Because for everything else, we have understood that it is mumkin al-wujud, that I can conceive of it, but that does not mean it necessarily exists. For everything that actually exists to exist, there will have to be a being that we can attribute the creation of all mumkin al wujud to, which is why he insists that God's existence is equal to his essence, that wujud and mahia are co-equivalent when talking about God.
At this juncture, can I ask, for example, the two things that you're showing us, essence and
Yeah.
existence, how is it different from like the Platonic forms and the, real, manifestation of that form in an actual real thing? So number one, that, and number two, when you're talking about contingent beings, contingent and necessary existence, this is used these days a lot as part of the ontological argument. And when they talk about contingent beings, they say, well, it is something that is dependent on something else for existing,
Yeah.
and the necessary existence is the one that is not dependent on it. So it's a dependence relationship rather than a probabilistic relationship where that you can conceive of something, but it's not necessary that it would exist as well, right? So it probably exists or it probably doesn't exist. It's uncertain in that sense, as opposed to that necessary existence, as you are describing it, it has 100% certainty, which means must exist, and it does exist, right?
Yeah. Okay. So I'll answer your second question first. You're right. A lot of people these days quote the ontological argument, or as it's known as the Kalam cosmological argument, right? That you can't have an infinite cycle of regress when you are talking about creation. You can't have an infinite cycle of regress when you are talking about creation. These people tend to misunderstand Avicenna. They think of contingency as being equal to temporality, that is, being bound by time, as opposed to what contingency actually is, which is bound by dependence. As we'll see in the Avicennan model, he thinks that the universe is actually co-eternal with God. So it isn't an issue of temporality, it's an issue of dependence. You're absolutely right when it comes to that. That the necessary existent is what makes the mumkin al-wujud possible. Now, Ibn Sina didn't actually want to create an argument for the existence of God. This is just a result of everything he's talking about. Nasiruddin at-Tusi actually highlights this as well. Nasiruddin at-Tusi is regarded as the reviver of peripatetic philosophy, that is the Aristotelian model, where he argues from Ibn Sina's books that God is actually a postulate, an axiom. The existence of God is an axiom for everything else existing. So it is indisputable because you cannot make sense of reality without postulating God's existence. So when what I'm talking about is different from that. I'm just talking about what he describes as mahia and what he describes as wujud, the bare bones of it. And eventually Ibn Sina develops that into being a relationship of dependence whereby wajibul wajud is definitely existent, and it is his existence that leads to the existence of other things. And those other things are mumkin, that is contingent. However, they are not necessary. And the reason they are not necessary is that we can conceive of them without them actually existing. Versus God, who cannot be conceived without existing. Because the fact that I am conceiving God means that I have already been created by him. If that wasn't the case, then I wouldn't be doing what I am doing right now. Think of it like a precursor in its most essential reductionist form to Descartes' argument of I think, therefore I am. That the reason I am thinking, the reason I am, is because God created me. And had God not existed, then I would not have existed either. Now, sorry, I've forgotten the first part of your question.
I was just asking that when you were describing essence and existence, right? So how is it different from the Platonic form and, the materialization of that
Okay,
form
yeah.
or
The
instance of it?
reason The reason that's different is because the Platonic model focuses on a realm where all of those ideal forms exist. For Ibn Sina, that's not the case. This is entirely a mental exercise that because I can think of a mythical beast that can exist but just doesn't. For example, a unicorn, right? There's no reason why a horse with a horn shouldn't exist. It can, even though it doesn't naturally occur. There's no perfect form of this in some higher realm that I have to aspire to be or that such a thing would aspire to be. So there's no
But
realm.
then
That's
see,
the reason.
that's where the word causes some confusion that uh, if that form or if that essence is not a thing, then all we have are just individual instances um, of things, right? There are horses, right? And there is no essence of a horse. There is no ideal form of a horse in a
No,
sense.
there doesn't have to be an ideal form, but I can conceive of one, right? Not an ideal one. It's just the fact that I have a mental image in my head. It's not ideal or anything at all. He doesn't focus on this idealistic aspect that there's a perfect form or a perfect being or a perfect
So,
model
but
that
then
something.
when we are talking about horses, so this horseness, that essence, what would that essence be?
Hoarseness is simply my conception of what a horse would be. It's not universal. It can be, but it's not.
So basically, you've just derived or reverse engineered that essence from what you have observed. So all
Yeah,
the
yeah,
horses that you've observed,
yeah,
that understanding of the horses has given you an image of what
exactly.
horseness is.
Yeah, yeah. That's really it. There's no perfect realm where this is happening. But what you do say about forms and a perfect sense, there is not with Mahia, but as we later see in Ibn Sina's entire model of cosmology, there is this concept of a higher being that we aspire to be like. That can be seen as Platonic, but because it isn't, it's very abstract, right? And it's abstract knowledge that can be overlapped with Neoplatonic uh, conceptions, but I personally don't think that's what he's talking about here. And we'll just get to that in a moment, so then I hope that will be clearer. So the proof of God derives from present ontological contingency, not temporal origins. This is what I said. There's actually no temporality in Ibn Sina's argument. If you see someone like Muhammad Hijab, or if you see someone like, just Dawa brothers in general, I don't want to name all of them, or even Hamza Soros to some extent, they'll talk about this contingent being as though it's bound by time. But in Ibn Sina's conception, even if the universe is eternal, an infinite chain, every link right now requires an external cause for it to exist right now. Because the idea is that we need certainty, we're going to make a baseline assumption that everything is eternal. Let's just accept that everything that has existed has always existed. I still need some actual external cause for all of that to exist because every existent, if it's necessary, then that precludes the issue of Mahia. The sun could have been different, could it not have? The earth could have been different. The lamp in front of me could have been different. You could have been different. I could have been different. Everything could have been different. We can conceive of a different type of earth. We can conceive of a different type of sun, a different type of moon. But for all of that difference to be possible, there needs to be one being who simply cannot be different. He has to be the same. He has to be constant. In this instance, it is important for me to clarify that Ibn Sina would not use the term he. He would use the term it, abstract. Because for Ibn Sina, God is actually not a personally involved being.
It's as you've described here, it's like a foundation. It's the
It's a
ground.
foundation. It's a mathematical principle. It's an axiom. It's not a living, breathing reality as most Muslims conceive of it. So, once again, I'm just giving these sort of I'm just sort of giving these examples or these little hooks so that what I say later makes sense. But for now, let's just focus on the vertical foundation, which is the necessary existent. That for all of these infinite things to exist, the eternal cause has to be the necessary existent, the foundational ground that confers existence to the entire chain simultaneously to the extent that all of them are dependent on the necessary existent who is beyond this chain, who is beyond time, who is beyond space, who is beyond everything for their existence. That he is what makes their existence make sense. Without them, there would have been without the necessary existent, there would have been no other existence. So Aristotle goes a step further. Ibn Sina takes a step back. Aristotle looks at it from the perspective of the prime mover or the unmoved mover, that everything is dominoes, let's just say that, and that there's a prime mover beyond the dominoes who's moved it. While Ibn Sina takes a step further back, and rather than looking at motion, he looks at ontology, existence itself. Aristotle sought to explain physical motion and physical occurrences, accidents as he called them, for which you needed an unmoved mover or a prime mover. Versus Ibn Sina, who wants to take a step back and look at things more holistically and explain ontologically why things exist. At this point, this slide will now make a lot of sense. So you have the ontological sorting mix. The necessary existent is the singular node where essence equals existence. That is a being whose essence, whose conception would not have been possible without its existence, and vice versa. Because for me to exist, he has to exist, and because he exists, his lack of existing is a fallacy, is irrational, is mahal, as he says. It is illogical, it is irrational.
So it
So
it almost feels like that there is an implication here, or there's a corollary here, which is it has to be one as well.
we'll get to that. Don't worry. We'll get to that. Necessary in itself. So the wajibul wujud is necessary in and of itself. Because he is wajibul wujud, he is necessary, and he is necessary because nothing else makes sense without that being existing. So in this situation, the essence is identical to the existence and it exists completely by itself without any dependence. Everything else that exists because of him. Not the fact that he created it at a specific moment in time, no. Just the existence itself of all of those things is because their existence abstractly is dependent on him existing. If he didn't exist, they wouldn't either. This being has to be absolutely simple and one. He cannot consist of multiplicity, because if that is the case, then I'm sure you can put two and two together and realize that that being would also be contingent and dependent on something else for its existence. For it to be necessary and not dependent on anything else, it has to be singular and absolutely one. Therefore, divine simplicity is a core of Ibn Sina's thought, absolutely essential to identifying God as Wajibul Wujud. However, there are existents that exist through another. These are eternal entities that never fail to exist. Their existence is conferred continuously by an external cause. An example of this in Ibn Sina's philosophy is celestial spheres and planets and stars. He thinks they are pre eternal. He thinks they are before time. He thinks there was never a moment when they were made. They have always existed and they will always exist. The key here is that because they are multiplicitous, and we'll see what that means for Ibn Sina, because the wajibul wujud gives way to the first intellect. And this is where the Neoplatonic overlap comes from. Gives way to the first intellect. The first intellect, in turn, comes with three things, which we'll look at later. The first intellect comes with the first intellect comes with form, right? Comes with the soul, and then comes with celestial spheres. Now, for Ibn Sina, as that happens, we'll see that this is contrary to monism. This is contrary to what Mullah Sadra says. This is contrary to what Ibn Arabi says. Because in monism, existence is fundamentally one being underlying all multiplicity. That beyond everything is there just one being. However, Ibn Sina's hierarchy is different. There's an ontological firewall, if you like. That this is the first intellect, it gives way to the second intellect, which gives way to the third intellect, and so on and so forth, and so on and so forth, until we arrive at the 10th intellect, which is where we are. And again, this sounds very strange at the moment, but as I explain it further on, you'll get exactly what I mean. The key takeaway of this is just remember this before we move on to the next slide. The system relies on absolute causal dependence, but strictly preserves the distinction between necessary existent and contingent being. In Ibn Arabi's conception, or Mullah Sadra's, the issue isn't that existence is unified by one singular entity. This is happening here as well. The issue is that everything is that entity, or nothing else beyond that entity exists. These are the only two conceptions of these two gentlemen's ideas that exist. One is entirely monistic, the other is pantheistic. In that, the distinction between the creator and the created is washed away, isn't it? Here, however, Ibn Sina is very firm. The necessary existent is not like the contingent existence. Nothing like it. So
Because
he preserves.
because
Hmm,
fundamentally, as soon as you say something else exists, irrespective of whether it's temporal or not, so if, as soon as you say there is a second existence, it's not monism. It's not
exactly,
wajibul wajud.
precisely. So even though there's a slight overlap because of his emanationist ideas, there is no ontological collapse of the difference in existence because he preserves that everything has a distinct existence and thereby he's affirming the existence of multiple things as contingent. So he preserves Tawheed, that there's nothing like God, but at the same time he preserves his philosophical justification that existence is still unified by a single cause. And now let's look at this. Absolute simplicity necessitates a singular immediate effect. That there's a cause and then there's an effect. Mind you, this isn't temporal. Please understand that. This is not related to time. This is simply a question of what is dependent on another being. So the apex is the necessary existent. Absolutely simple, unified, and immaterial. There is no distinction in the being of God at all. He's abstract, transcendent. However, he gives way to an effect. That effect is what he calls the first intellect. This is the highest created being. It is immaterial, self aware, and acts as the cosmic bridge or the ontological bridge between divine unity, Tawheed, and cosmic multiplicity. This is the first contingent being or the thing that is dependent on another for its existence because it is necessary through another. It's not mumkin al wujud, it is necessary through another. Think of this as a mode of creation in our terms, even though in Ibn Sina's terms it's not correct to call this a creation, and technically it's not. But this is what gives way to another created entity.
First effect that you're talking about here. Now,
Yeah,
the wajibul wajud, we could understand because what we are saying is that essence and existence is one, and that is a very, not just singular, that is a very unique possibility, right? So
yeah,
it can only exist once,
once.
and that is it. You cannot have any other possibility there.
Yeah.
So it will only be one, but the effect, the first effect, why does it have to be one, or why is it one has, you
It's
know,
not
it
one.
could have been any number of effects after from that one cause.
The reason is that in Ibn Sina's paradigm, for multiplicity to originate out of a singular entity, it has to be gradual. You cannot take a jump from a singular, absolutely simple entity to then millions or billions of others. There has to be a
It's a
bridge.
very evolutionary kind of argument that
Yeah, it is. It is.
simplicity kind of snowballs into complexity.
Exactly. That's the idea. Simplicity snowballs into complexity. So what makes that possible is the effect. The first intellect that just acts as the bridge. So a purely simple cause can only produce a single immediate effect. Multiplicity cannot arise directly from absolute unity. So one singular will lead to another singular. However, that singular entity is not absolutely single. That is where you then get the bridge for multiple beings to then arise later. So multiplicity is generated through the tripartite self-awareness of each intellect. Uh, right? Now, what does this mean? There's the first existent, there's the first intellect that has an awareness of God, because with the first intellect comes into existence the soul and a celestial sphere. We've introduced these three vectors, if you like, into this model. So the soul has an awareness of God, right? And awareness of itself as necessary through God. That is, the first intellect has that. And then awareness of itself as contingent in its own essence, right? The soul and the first intellect have this. Now that takes three effects. There's a downward vector. There's the next intellect, purely immaterial. Then there is the lateral vector, the celestial soul, the animating principle. As I said, there's the first intellect, there is the celestial soul, and then there's a celestial sphere. The first intellect comes with a celestial soul that is aware of God, aware of itself as necessary through God, and awareness of itself as contingent. That is the first intellect itself. That creates
We
a, or that
we've been using this word intellect a lot, and what does this
I
intellect
explain it.
word mean? Because are we speaking in material terms, immaterial
Immaterial,
terms?
immaterial terms. Just pure consciousness, pure knowledge, if you like. It's unexplainable, so to speak. Um, Now, forgive me, I mixed the term somewhere along the way, but just to clarify one final time. The first intellect has awareness of God, awareness of itself as necessary through God, and awareness of itself as contingent in its own essence. So it is necessary, but at the same time contingent. The key being that while God is necessary by himself, the first intellect is necessary because of God. So it is dependent.
In the first in the first existence, which is God in you know in this ontology,
Yeah.
we did not mention self-awareness there. So that entity does not possess self-awareness, but the effect and what came out of it, the first intellect, it possesses self-awareness.
I wouldn't necessarily say that because for Ibn Sina, okay. So we've seen this in other ontological models as well, that there is a martaba ahadiyya, right? Which is just pure abstractness. You can't actually talk about it. You can't pinpoint it. So he's very silent about, at least so far from what I've read. Again, this is a preliminary study, so don't hold it as a final one. But he does acknowledge the fact that God knows things. He says that.
Because
But
see, the thing is, knowing implies a knower. If we are, you know, abstracting it out almost to a point level where there is no other detail, it's just a point almost, right? It's just knowledge. That's it. So, so the
he doesn't say
separation of,
God is knowledge.
yeah, so separation of that knowledge and knower doesn't exist at that point level over
He
there.
he doesn't say God is knowledge. He says the first intellect is. So regarding God himself, this is particularly controversial because Nasiruddin at-Tusi has a defense of it. that people have misunderstood, but someone like Ghazali, someone like Ibn Taymiyyah, well respected, very smart, brilliant people, assert the view that Ibn Sina says that God does not know things in particulars, he knows things in universals, therefore, God is not the knower of everything. Now, what this means, we'll just discuss in a moment once we go through the whole cosmic hierarchy that Ibn Sina lays out. But he does acknowledge that God knows things. What they are and how that is a different story, but the knowing concept is there. So even though it's a principle, it's a point, it's not completely devoid of meaning either. Because if it was devoid of meaning, you wouldn't say it's absolutely single or one either. You wouldn't say that it is the necessary existent either, because those are still, I mean, I'm sure Ibn Sina might slap me if I said that, but it's some form of quiddity, some form of being definable. So that's still there. It's not entirely out of the equation yet. But the first intellect, we've gone down that path. You know, awareness of God, awareness of itself as being necessary through God, and then awareness of itself as contingent in its own essence. That in turn has three effects as well. And this is where the chain of multiplicity is entirely broken. A singularity is entirely broken. Because now you have these multiple things being sort of consolidated or compressed in one entity, right? So now absolute unity no longer exists, therefore multiplicity can thrive. So you have three effects that stem from the first intellect. The next intellect, which is the second intellect. At the same time, you have a celestial soul. The celestial soul and the celestial sphere, which is a physical body, have a relationship. And that relationship is one of motion. The celestial soul comprehends the fact that there is a higher form of knowledge that it wants to be like. It wants to be entirely immaterial, though it is not. To strive for perfection, the celestial soul animates the physical body, the celestial sphere, to go around in a circular motion, to go around in orbit around something, as a form of striving for perfection. Now, this sounds very bizarre, especially when I add this caveat or
It
detail.
sounds poetic, but it doesn't sound like,
To you,
comes out.
to you. It doesn't sound like that to you because we're living in an age where we now know how physical motion works. Another bizarre caveat, which might be very strange for people today, is that this is all happening in a geocentric model. The Earth is the center of the universe, by the way. So the first celestial sphere, the first layer, is the outer stars. Those are animated by the celestial soul's desire to be like the first intellect. And because it cannot achieve that, it just makes the outer stars go in a circular motion round and round. Because a circular motion in Ibn Sina's paradigm is perfect, right? It's constant. Much like pure knowledge, that it's just constant. So we'll just follow that road. So here there's a nice little diagram of everything that's happening. The first intellect produces the second intellect plus sphere of fixed stars. So these just go around in perpetual motion forever. The second intellect produces the third, a celestial soul, and then Saturn. So the soul of Saturn, let's just say that, right? The soul of Saturn prompts Saturn to just go in a circular motion ad infinitum, forever, as a mode of chasing perfection. Clear till here? This proceeds through the third intellect, Jupiter, fourth intellect, Mars, fifth intellect, Sun, sixth intellect, Venus, seventh intellect, Mercury, eighth intellect, Moon. Now I'll stop here for a moment. One thing you'll find here is that Neptune is missing, as is Uranus. Because once again, this is, if I'm not wrong, before Copernicus. This is before Galileo. So the geocentric model is still very much in vogue, by the way.
It almost feels like an observer's view, right?
It is.
Someone, sitting on Earth looking out, and whatever you could say. is the order of things, the depth order of things as they see out. Whatever they see, they are kind of giving them names, right?
And you can't really deny the fact that it's entirely irrational. For a man who has limited knowledge, I'd just like to point out this is very complex. Like, if you just have to explain why things exist and how they exist, and you know nothing about science, and you're solely reliant upon whatever your mind can conceive of and rationally justify, this is a pretty good model. He explains everything. Why the motion is circular, how it actually happens, why multiplicity arises out of singularity, how that happens. So he conceives of all of these things. Whether or not they're defunct is another question, but one can admire the sheer brilliance of this man for just coming up with this.
Yeah, so
And
the
each,
thing is that it almost sounds like that the desire that is driving motion, it sounds like his version of gravity.
it is
Maybe that was the
yeah, it
conception of
is.
gravity at that time.
Yeah, because the man couldn't test gravity, he didn't know what it was. So
No,
each
but then
intellect,
then there is the idea of frame of reference as well, right? So he is looking from a particular frame of reference,
yeah,
and from that frame of reference, Earth could be a center, right? When you say
because you
Earth is
can't see the
not the
earth moving, no?
center, when you say Earth is not the center, basically you are just shifting the frame of reference to some other place, and from that point of view, you can observe that it's not the center.
Definitely, definitely. So as we proceed down, we arrive at the eighth intellect and then the ninth intellect, right? And then the tenth intellect is special. Now you'll ask, why is it special? It's special because the tenth intellect is the active intellect. It doesn't generate a separate celestial sphere. It acts as a direct metaphysical interface with the human world. It's a literal bridge, if you like. The tenth active intellect plays three roles, three functions. And this is my conception of it. You won't find it anywhere else. It actualizes forms. So it projects intelligibles, things into pure potentiality that is matter, granting them physical form. It creates things. This is not happening anywhere else. This actually creates temporal forms. And then it confers immaterial, rational souls to human bodies arising through the material process. And then, and this is the key part here, our knowledge, whatever it is, right? We have a perception, and then there are things as they are, right? The actualization of forms and the generation of souls. That leads to two consequences. Things exist as they are, I can perceive them, right? How do I make sense of them, though? How do I know them really? The actualization of knowledge is done by the 10th intellect when what I perceive somehow links with the 10th active intellect, and suddenly I can now understand something or know something fully.
Almost the what you're describing here almost sounds very very modern in the sense that the idea of an immaterial soul doesn't really exist in modern science anywhere, right? So what is assumed over there is that through material processes, basically an emergent um, you know consciousness or behavior that we are seeing, that is what we refer to as soul, rather than it being like some sort of a duality where soul is an immaterial thing somehow interacting with a material body and it's manifesting itself through that.
Exactly. No, definitely. It's very modern, and you'll love to know this as well. I had this written in my notes that the active intellect, when it gives form to matter, that governs the four rudimentary elements: earth, air, fire, water, plants, animals, human lives, and is the source of human intellect as well as prophecy, by the way, in Ibn Sina's conception. So the sublunary world, us, the realm of good and bad, the realm of good and evil, exists because of the tenth intellect, and the earth is also a part of it. Except rather than there being some pursuance of motion here, there's a pursuance of morality. And that happens through the 10th intellect. Now,
So,
you'll ask,
just
yeah.
a question. So, are we still talking about the ontological relationship here, or at some stage we have already introduced time here?
That's a good
So,
question.
has time been introduced at any of these stages, or
Time
sir, does time exist in this final
time exists
10th
in this
stage?
final paradigm. Yeah, it does.
Okay.
This is not pre-eternal. This is why it's the active intellect because it's actually actively doing things, right? As opposed to the other intellects, which have pre-eternally or before time just been in their little sphere, so to speak, right? They've had their perpetual motion for a while. And I guess as someone who can appreciate Newtonian physics, you will maybe see the value of saying that, yeah, motion is perpetual unless unless it's interrupted by an external force.
First law.
Yeah, you can see some idea of that, right? If I want to retrospectively prove it, I don't know if Ibn Sina was doing that or not, but I think you can see some baseline rudimentary physics taking place here because we have to remember Ibn Sina is a scientist for his day and age. So he will study motion in some capacity. Obviously not as well as Newton did, but something's happening. So this realm, the sublunary world where the earth is, exists because of the 10th active intellect. But rather than it pursuing motion, it pursues a war of good and evil. And what's the highest good for Aristotelian philosophers? Knowledge. Which is why in Ibn Sina's paradigm, even prophecy is linked to the 10th active intellect. And this is why there were so many fatwa of kufr against Ibn Sina, because all the roles of creation and revelation that are taken or attributed to God in the Quran, Ibn Sina attributes to the 10th intellect, who he identifies as the Archangel Gabriel, and says that in the Quran, the reason why it is being attributed to God is because Gabriel exists, or the 10th active intellect exists because of God. So there is attribution because of that, even though it is the 10th active intellect which is doing things. So human knowledge is abstracted from senses and actualized metaphysically. That sounds like a word salad. But all it means in its core essentials is that I have sensory perception, I gather data, and then I abstract it. From looking at you, I think of human, right? I abstract it. I strip the idea of a human that I have perceived away from the material accident that I am witnessing to universal forms that I am now thinking of. Mind you, there's no realm, so it's not entirely Platonic. I'm sure you'll see the similarity in language, but it's not entirely Platonic. There is a difference. It's minute, but it's there. I isolate the universal form and then I'm able to correlate the two, right? I can see a human. I know what a human is. Oh, then wait, I can think. I now know what a human is. I now know how a human is. That leads me to comprehending comprehending the human. And that process is called actualization, where the human intellect achieves conjunction with the active intellect. Okay, this is where Ibn Sina, not being a scientist in the modern sense, comes up because he doesn't actually explain how this happens. There's no explanation for this. This is a metaphysical, not a physical process, and the active intellect does not literally physically transmit data. It is the immaterial catalyst that renders abstracted forms fully intelligible. Would you like to guess what he thinks this process is? In the Quran, you know how God says he breathed a ruh into into Adam?
Yeah.
Well, there you have it. This is the ruh. This is the result of the ruh. Like not literally the ruh, obviously the ruh is the soul, but that is why it happens. I've added a segment here on just looking at how there's a shift from Aristotle's bare bones framework that looks at the physical occurrences or accidents of nature and of things that exist into Ibn Sina's ontological upgrade, if you like, right? Because he's discussing things at a deeper level, at a higher level. So while Aristotle looks at the form and and matter of a thing that exists as a way to understand it, Ibn Sina looks at the mahiya and wujud, the essence and the existence. While Aristotle conceives of a thing as either being a potential thing that happens in your mind or as an actual thing that exists, Ibn Sina takes that further and says, oh, well, that's what leads to contingency, things that are possible, and the thing that is necessary. It's because of Aristotle's idea here. Then Aristotle talks about the unmoved mover. That explains motion, right? The physical accident. Whereas for Ibn Sina, the necessary existent explains existence itself. The final causation, right? Final causation, which is why a thing moves or why accidents occur, the reason for that shifts in Ibn Sina's paradigm, and he talks about celestial motion. Once again, things are being talked about in a higher grade of reality, and that is driven by the intellectual desire of the celestial soul to achieve perfection like the intellect, whichever layer it is, first, second, well, second, third, first, second, third, fourth, whichever, other than the 10th. And the ambiguous intellect, right? This sort of immaterial desire for knowledge that leads to people doing things or having morality or having wisdom or having knowledge is replaced by the rigorous active intellect, which actively plays a part in instilling knowledge, in instilling the soul, and in instilling actualization and giving things form and giving things matter and creating the sublunary world. So, lastly, I'd just like to talk about the Neoplatonic structures that have been adopted while rejecting Platonic forms. So, we're all aware of Plato's allegory of the cave. I won't dwell on it much. But from that, Neoplatonic philosophers, especially Plotinus, came up with this idea of the Platonic the the reality of souls or the layer of existence which has souls or has perfect forms. In our terminology, it's known as alame amsal. In some conceptions, forms and souls have been mixed. Plotinus himself, I believed, had the notion of forms separate from souls. So, rejection of independent forms. Universals do not exist in a separate transcendent realm, they exist solely as abstractions within the mind. That's different from Neoplatonic conceptions. Universals exist, but they're there in the mind. There's no realm where, there's a sort of reflection of the one that animates all of these things as shadows, and none of that's true, and all of it's monistic. That's not happening here. However, there is reality through dependence, not participation. Things are structured by causal ontological dependence, not by participating in separate ideal forms that are then unified because they all emanate from the same reality, and in essence, because they are shadows of the same reality, they are the reality. That's not happening here at all. It's just abstraction. When I see you, when I see me, I can abstract the idea of a human, right? That's what makes deductive reasoning possible. I can, and inductive reasoning obviously as well, and of course people will have an issue. But there are definitely axioms that go along with deductive and inductive reasoning as well. All of those are made possible because of the abstraction that I have, That's what makes syllogisms possible as well. So there is a structural compromise, which is why Ibn Sina is regarded as being a bridge between the Neoplatonic and the Aristotelian worlds. He is regarded as an original thinker because of this, and I think that this is an accident because he read books attributed to Aristotle, which was actually a summary of the Enneads written by Plotinus. It was, if I'm not wrong, the title was the Theologica Aristotelia or something along those lines, or the Summa Aristotelia, something like that. So Ibn Sina borrows the Neoplatonic emanation hierarchy, descent from unity, but anchors it strictly within an Aristotelian epistemology and an essence/existence framework where there's an ontological firewall preventing, emphasis on preventing from the preventing the distinction between the creator and the creation from being washed away, and the necessary existent is never like the contingent existent, even though he insists that the contingent existent is is eternal. So at this point, I'd just like to now go off on a little bit of a tangent and talk about how Ibn Sina is received by everyone. So at this point, I'd just like to talk a little bit about why, or sorry, or how Ibn Sina is perceived by the larger Muslim community. In the last segment of this podcast that we had, I spoke to you about orthodoxy and Sunnism, right? Just to borrow from that a little bit, we spoke about how almost every strand of every intellectual movement found some form of acceptance in Sunnism, right? Even Shiism to some degree, because you had orthodox Sunni Sufis who'd have a conception of Vilaya. Not like the Imamis, but close enough that you were now relying on divinely ordained charisma to make a person religiously valuable. Ibn Sina represents the peripatetic philosophers who are entirely rejected by Sunnis, entirely. In fact, Imam Ghazali, and I've cited this quote multiple times for different purposes, finally, I'll do it for the purpose it was meant to. He writes in Tahafut al Falasifa, the disagreements we have as the Ahl Sunnah wal Jama'ah with the Karamiya, with the Mu'tazila, with the Ahlul Hadith, with whosoever else, are disagreements in the corollaries of religion, the details of religion, the details of Tawheed. The disagreement we have with these falasifa, and he says they are zanadika, they are heretics, and that they are mulhideen to the extent that they don't even believe in God. We will use everyone's arguments against these because at the end of the day, they are Muslim, the falasifa are not. Now, why? Why does he say that? We've seen that throughout Ibn Sina's ontological conception and cosmological, God isn't active, right? God isn't active. God doesn't play a part in anyone's life. God's a mathematical principle. God's a principle of logic. God's a postulate. God's an axiom. There's no process of creation where he'll intend something and that irada or that mashia will lead to something. No, nothing like that. In fact, and this is particularly heretical, creation doesn't happen because God is or the necessary existent is making it happen consciously. It's happening because it is a part of the necessary existence nature to give way or to have an effect. Just like a light has the effect of creating, well, light for me, right? Or making things visible. It's not a conscious decision. So you have erased God being a conscious entity and just made him the cause, which is why Ghazali says that this is a deistic framework. God's not actually playing a role in the universe anymore. Gabriel is, who is attributed with all the things that God is attributed with: creation, will, even. And you'll find this very clearly in Ismaili philosophy of Nasiruddin Khusro, where the 10th intellect is actually the all-knower, the all-seer, the beneficent, the merciful. All of those things are actually attributions made to Gabriel, not God. I personally haven't come across this in Ibn Sina's ideas yet. I know he has done some tafsir where I believe he may have said these things, but I've seen a clear expression of these in Ismaili terms. Now, why are the Ismailis relevant? The Ismailis are relevant because they are the flag bearers of Avicennan metaphysics. They mix it with Neoplatonic ideas later, but in their primary conception, you've heard of the Ikhwan as-Safa, certainly. A lot of them were Ismaili. A lot of them were primarily Ismaili. I believe so. This is my opinion. It could be wrong, but from the factual research I have done, that is my opinion. They were usually Ismaili. So what happens then, right? Because God isn't playing an active role, so that's deistic, first of all. Secondly, because God is the necessary existent, Ibn Sina says that he is aware of universals, not particulars. This means God does not know everything. However, Nasiruddin Tusi offers a defense of this. Nasiruddin Tusi says that Ghazali and others have understood this point, have misunderstood this point. And by the way, it's entirely possible I'm misunderstanding Nasiruddin Tusi right now because these are very difficult writers. So please spare me if I have made some error. I'll inshallah correct it in another little podcast that we have, if I believe it that's the case. The idea is that because God knows universals, he doesn't know accidents, he doesn't know particulars. But because he knows universals, doesn't the universal also encompass the particular? It does. Therefore, he knows that as well. However, because he is beyond space, because he is beyond time, you cannot say that God is aware of something as it is happening because he has already been aware of it. So this is a defense of Ibn Sina's idea here. But where does it get particularly ridiculous as a Muslim? When prophethood is reduced to an intellectual exercise. And in fact, the Quran, na'uzubillah, naql kufr, laysa bi kufr, I guess we should say that here, that the Quran is nothing other than the manifestation of the prophets or prophethood's creative faculties that were bestowed as an inspiration by the 10th intellect, Gabriel, as he is known in the Quran, through the highest degree of actualization. Then let's look at what the afterlife is. The afterlife is nothing, according to Ibn Sina. The afterlife is merely existing as a quasi immaterial entity pursuing knowledge infinitely, pursuing wisdom and knowledge infinitely. So far, what have we had? God is deistic. Prophethood is God knows what this is, but it's not what we think it is, or what any Orthodox Muslim thinks it is. The afterlife is immaterial. There's no hell and heaven. It's just a pursuance of knowledge. People who are bad, they're ignorant, right? So they won't pursue knowledge. Everything that is orthodox is reduced to rubble. Which is why I know you will definitely criticize what I say heavily right now, but let me just say that I find this conception to be a lot more dangerous than Sufism. Because in Sufism, you are still preserving to some degree, might I add. We've done a thing on this as well, but there's still a general conception of fine. There is God plays an active part, right? That there is some idea of bliss in heaven and hell, that there is some idea of prophethood being divine inspiration from the divine himself. There's nothing here. It's an empty almost mathematical situation. And this is where you can argue that maybe Ibn Sina was a Darwinist before Darwin.
So it almost the views feel actually quite modern in a sense, right?
Yeah,
They might align with somebody who might just look at it more from a materialistic philosophy. They might think that they actually make more sense in that sense.
yeah. Which is why I just like to say this is my hypothesis, and I have been discussing it. But the purpose of these podcasts I have with you is just to share what I'm learning, because I maybe there's someone else out there who enjoys these topics as much as we do, and they might benefit from like a preliminary analysis as well that isn't as serious as a Root Religious journal or Brill's works. So something light, something a little bit informal, if you like. That
Any of the modern atheists, I mean, they wouldn't object to this philosophy
I
because
don't think they would. Yeah.
they all believe in something existing in the first place, let's call it universe. So they believe in something, right? If it's a
Mm,
big bang, there was something there, right? It's always something is always there, so they would accept that. And of course they would accept whether at a universal level or at a global level, they'll accept some sort of an evolutionary
framework
process
or
of
blueprint.
things emerging out
Yeah,
of it. And after that, whether at human level as well, right? Human intelligence, consciousness, that emerging out of the same processes, they would accept all of this. And in this case, the formless, the attributeless God is something that would be acceptable to them.
it is.
It's a personal God that they cannot accept.
Yes. And
And
I think
also, if you remove the concept of heaven and hell and life after and returning and accountability, also that is acceptable to them.
yeah. And because it's so acceptable to everyone other than us, and even Sufis, by the way. Ghazali was a Sufi. This is my hypothesis, I could be wrong, but we know that Ghazali had a major crisis after his refutation of the philosopher, right? Where he struggled to reconcile what he rationally knew and what religion was telling him, and how tasawwuf helped him do that. I think a reason why he then accepts tasawwuf in the way that he does is because you needed an alternate parallel framework to the one I just put before you.
Or maybe you need an alternate ontology, right? So it's a
Yeah,
different ontology
that's
that you
what I
need.
mean. That's what I mean. You needed a different ontology, different model for existence that is more reconcilable than this. Because let's be fair, Sufism was reconciled by Ghazali. It's not like it wasn't, right? He did reconcile it. Shah Waliullah reconciled it as well. So did Sheikh Ahmad Sirhandi. All of these people in their own eras have reconciled tasawwuf with Orthodox Islam, such that I don't think you can find any major scholar from the past 800 years who was not a Sufi. Everyone, even Ibn Taymiyyah himself, by the way, is a Sufi. Not a Neoplatonic one, sure. Not a Shirki one, sure. But a Sufi nonetheless. So I think it was about presenting an alternative model for why things exist that wasn't so material heavy, which is why perhaps this existed, which is why, maybe Sufism found acceptance and gained currency because, on the other hand, you had this, which doesn't even have the same language as far as religion's concerned, because there's no wahi, there's no ilham, there's no divinely ordained things happening, there's nothing. It's empty. It's robotic. Whereas Neoplatonic thought, even Plotinus, it's very mystical, right? There's an element of the supernatural. There's a veil of existence to be pierced. There's a lot to be done. There's a journey of self-discovery where you are personally in contact with God. Think of it this way, diametrically, if you look at these two views, isn't this the diametric opposite of everything Ibn Sina and the philosophers are saying? This is the opposite, right? Sufism. You have a completely a personal deistic deity in Avicennan thought, and then you have a being that is still communicating with you, who you can hear, who you can talk to, who is talking back to you and you listen to him, who is inspiring you actively. There, you've answered it, right? And the whole Neoplatonic idea of emanationism is there. So there's no existential crisis as to how do we justify how things exist because, well, lo and behold, everything's a shadow of God. So you've unified existence, you've made sense of why things exist, you've ensured that God is not deistic. Well, then what's left? You've
I
accomplished
mean,
your goal, right?
that sounds very actually scientific, you know. All you have are like fundamental forces, and then matter
Yeah,
is producing everything out of it. And there's no personality, there's no consciousness there, and it's all emergent out of it, and that's it. There's no meaning there. There's no. It's not going anywhere. That's
yeah.
the perfect scientific story. And
And then what?
it almost feels like Sufism in this case is the refuge of the failed philosopher.
Yeah. And Ghazali was that, wasn't he?
So I mean, once you hit this wall, then if you are still a philosopher, then probably Sufism saves you, and it gives you something that looks remotely like, or looks vaguely similar to what the Orthodox believe in.
Because at the end of the day, let's just remember, even Sufism has the martabe Allah, right? But they rationalize it by saying, well, there's a martabe Wahadiyya where God has some attributes. It's a counter to this, as far as I can tell. Again, I'm only 18, 19 years old, so like we'll read a bit more in 30 years and figure it out. But from what I've been able to tell so far, and I'm not entirely badly read either, so there's still some justification for this. But I think that this is my explanation for the time being of why Sufism gained currency the way it did. There is one point at which I'd like to end, and this is probably what our next podcast will be on: Shiism and its relative acceptance of peripatetic philosophy because of Nasiruddin at-Tusi. Because everything I've pointed out to you is how people generally understand Ibn Sina and the problems they find in orthodox belief with Ibn Sina's ideas. Nasiruddin at-Tusi is a very, very celebrated theologian in Shi'i thought. In fact, he is the only original ethical philosopher in Islam, period. And he is also very orthodox. He's not one of your Ibn Arabi-esque characters. No, no, no. He's firmly grounded in Imami theology, well versed in their ahadith, well versed in the Quran. He thinks Ibn Sina was saying something else. However, he does repent at the end of his life. And to conclude, Ibn Taymiyyah, as always, brings this narration in as he does for everyone else. Ibn Qayyim does as well. Ibn Qayyim does for sure, Ibn Taymiyyah, I'm not entirely sure, but Ibn Qayyim definitely brings this narration in that nearing the end of his days, Ibn Sina repented and became an orthodox Muslim and renounced all of the philosophy. Whether he did or not, wallahu alam, but it would be, sorry, that's my cat causing havoc. But it's a thing. So that's it from me. I hope this was informative. And yeah, Allah Hafiz.
Yeah, thank you very much for sharing your knowledge with us, and look forward to the next session then. Thank you very much.